I used to think betrayal came with warning signs, a shift in tone, a door left half open, a look that lingers too long. But that night inside a ballroom drowning in gold and champagne, I learned that sometimes betrayal wears diamonds and smiles for the camera. The air shimmered with money. Every laugh felt rehearsed, every gesture choreographed like my family had been waiting for this exact performance. The Bennett name was shining again, they said. $100,000 wedding to prove that everything, our fortune, our legacy, our perfection, was intact. I watched from the edge of the crowd, glass in hand, pretending to belong to the spectacle I had paid for, but wasn't invited into. My sister Lila glided through the room like she'd been born for the applause. My mother followed her every step with the kind of pride she never reserved for me. And my father God, my father, stood tall under the lights, the proud patriarch of a flawless family. When he took the microphone, the room fell silent. Cameras lifted. The chandeliers reflected in every glass like frozen stars. "We're so proud of our only daughter," he said. The applause was thunderous. My breath caught in my throat. Somewhere deep inside, something cracked quietly, completely. That was the moment I realized they hadn't just forgotten me. They had erased me. And none of them had any idea that the night they celebrated their perfect daughter was the night everything they built would begin to fall. The chandeliers glittered like ice over a sea of champagne and sequins. Laughter rolled through the ballroom of the Waverly Hotel in downtown Chicago, echoing off marble floors and mirrored walls. Everything gleamed from the white orchids to the silver cutlery, every corner screaming wealth and control. It was my sister's night. Lila, the youngest, the golden one, marrying into a family that had just enough money and influence to make my parents forget anyone else existed. I walked in quietly, my heels soft against the carpet. No one looked up. A photographer brushed past me chasing the bridal party. My father's business partners huddled near the open bar glasses raised high. My mother Eleanor stood near the grand staircase, diamonds catching the light, her smile practiced to perfection. When her eyes met mine, something flickered there, recognition followed by a polite distance. She nodded, once the way you'd greet a distant acquaintance, then turned to adjust Lila's veil. I found my table near the back. Place cards written in gold ink lined every plate, but mine was missing. I stood there for a second scanning the glossy names, investors, designers, donors, people who mattered. My chair was next to a pillar almost hidden from view. Perfect, I thought. Invisible fits me. I poured myself water while the band shifted from jazz to pop. The MC's voice echoed over the speakers, welcoming everyone to the union of two extraordinary families. I looked around and wondered if anyone in the room noticed how perfectly curated the night was, how every laugh sounded just a little rehearsed. Lila entered, then radiant in a gown that probably cost as much as my condo. The crowd rose to their feet as she glided down the aisle of light. She looked like she belonged there, bathed in gold and attention. My mother's face glowed with pride, and my father Robert clapped too hard too long. They had worked for this moment not for love but for legacy. Dinner came with speeches. The waiter served roasted duck and truffle risotto, while my father took the microphone. He stood at the head of the room, a man who loved audiences more than truth. The spotlight hit his silver hair as he raised his glass. "We are so proud tonight," he began, his voice deep and confident. "So proud of our only daughter, Lila." Applause burst like fireworks. Champagne glasses clinked. Someone behind me said, "She's stunning, isn't she?" I froze. The sound faded. Only the words remained slicing through me. Our only daughter. I waited for him to correct himself. Maybe he'd add, both our daughters, or some small acknowledgement, but he didn't. My mother laughed, her arm around Lila's waist as the photographer snapped pictures. My father continued thanking guests, the company's clients, the groom's parents. My name wasn't mentioned. Not once. A server leaned toward me. "Miss, would you like wine?" "No," I said. "Water's fine." I could feel the heat rising in my throat, a mix of humiliation and disbelief. I had helped them plan this wedding. I had handled the invoices when the event coordinator called about overdue deposits. When Dad's design firm nearly defaulted, I'd moved money from my own account to keep it afloat. And now, standing under those glittering lights, I realized they'd taken even that and turned it into another stage for Lila. When the applause faded, I slipped out to the hallway. The scent of roses followed me, sweet and cloying. I stood by the mirror near the restroom, staring at my reflection. My lipstick was perfect, my hair neat, but my eyes looked older than they should have. A photographer passed by, his camera swinging at his side. He paused, polite smile, professional tone. "Excuse me, are you with the Bennett family?" I hesitated, watching his face. He seemed embarrassed by the question, already maybe sensing he'd said something wrong. "I used to be," I said quietly. He blinked, nodded awkwardly, then walked off toward the dance floor. Music swelled again. Through the open doors, I saw my father take another toast, his arm around Lila, my mother standing beside them, radiant under the chandeliers. The guests rose, cameras flashing, laughter rippling like a tide I could never reach. I wanted to leave. I wanted to stay just long enough to see if anyone would notice me standing there. They didn't. My mother's eyes brushed past me, once empty and dismissive, before she turned away. I walked outside to the terrace. The air was cold, the city lights glittering below like distant promises. I could still hear the muffled music behind me, the rhythm of a family that had no place for me anymore. I leaned on the railing and tried to steady my breath. For a moment, I thought of walking back inside, forcing a smile, pretending it didn't matter. But something inside me had already shifted. This was more than an oversight, more than words spoken carelessly in a speech. It was erasure, deliberate and final. The night pressed against me, and I realized I'd been standing in the same spot for minutes, watching the reflection of the ballroom shimmer in the glass doors. My sister laughed inside, a sound like champagne spilling. My mother's hand rested proudly on her shoulder. I straightened, brushed a tear before it could fall, and walked toward the elevators. As I pressed the button, I caught my reflection again. Calm, composed, almost unrecognizable. Behind me, the ballroom erupted into applause once more. I didn't turn back. That was the last time I stood under their lights. Outside, the night air cut against my skin, but I kept walking until the noise of the ballroom faded behind me. The valet offered to bring my car around, and I nodded, not trusting my voice. When the door closed and the city lights blurred through the windshield, I felt the weight of years pressing down heavier than the silence that filled the car. It wasn't just tonight. It had been building my entire life. I had always been the serious one, the dependable one, the one who didn't need help. Growing up in Evanston, our house looked picture perfect, from the outside white brick manicured lawn, Christmas lights strung neatly every winter. Inside, though, everything revolved around appearances. My mother managed image like a business, and my father built his company, Bennett Interiors, on the illusion of stability. When Lila was born, she was the miracle child they'd prayed for after years of infertility. By the time I was old enough to notice, she already had her own spotlight. I didn't envy her then. I just learned early that my role was to make things work. I took summer jobs while she took summer trips. At 16, I worked at a cafe after school so I could buy textbooks while she got a new convertible for her birthday. My mother used to say, "You're so mature for your age, Olivia. You'll thank me one day." I did thank her. I thanked her for everything, even when it hurt. When I got into Northwestern, I knew we couldn't afford the tuition, not after the market crash that hit my father's firm. So I took night shifts at a bookstore and paid for my own classes. Meanwhile, Lila posted pictures from her art program in Paris, sipping espresso under the Eiffel Tower, smiling like life owed her sunlight. My parents sent her money every month and told me how proud they were of her creativity. After graduation, I joined the company. Bennett Interiors was a mess, maxed out credit lines, unpaid invoices, tax notices piling up in drawers. I spent nights in that office crunching numbers, calling suppliers, refinancing debt. I found ways to keep the company afloat, even convinced a small bank in Denver to extend another loan. It worked. Within 2 years, the company was stable again. When the paperwork came through, I noticed something strange. My name wasn't listed anywhere in the ownership filings. I told myself it didn't matter. It was a family business. Titles weren't important. Still, a small part of me knew the truth. I was holding it together while they held the spotlight. One afternoon, I got a call from a collections agency asking for me by name. I thought it was a mistake until they mentioned a credit card I never opened. My father had used my social security number to apply for a line of credit. When I confronted him, he didn't even look ashamed. "It's our family's name," he said. "We're in this together." I remember staring at him, wondering if he heard how wrong that sounded. But in our house, arguments died before they started. My mother stepped in, her voice calm and clipped. "Let your father handle this, Olivia. Don't make a scene. I paid the debt myself." It seemed easier than the humiliation of explaining why my father had stolen my identity. Years later, when the company started growing again, Lila came to me crying over her credit cards. She had blown through tens of thousands of dollars, designer handbags, vacations, weekend trips to New York. I transferred the balance to my account and told her I'd take care of it, but she needed to change. She hugged me, promised to do better. A month later, she showed up with a new car. Sometimes I wondered if she even knew how much she owed me. For years, I told myself that keeping quiet was the right thing to do. Families protect each other. My silence became habit, a survival tactic. Every birthday, every holiday dinner, I smiled for pictures I wasn't really in. My mother's compliments were small, polite, transactional. "You look lovely tonight," she'd say, then turn to gush about Lila's latest gallery show. When the housing market picked up, I pitched a design project that doubled our revenue. The profit was enough to pay off old loans. That same quarter, my father invested the money into a new property in Lincoln Park, but he didn't tell me until I saw the deed framed in his office. "Whose name is on it?" I asked, though I already knew. "Your sister's," he said. "It'll help her credit score." I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. I'd built something solid, and they'd handed it over to her as if it were a trophy. My mother called later that night, her tone smooth and proud. "Isn't it wonderful Lila finally has her own home, her home, my work?" I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their validation. But when I saw Lila's Instagram post a week later posing in front of that house captioned, "Blessed beyond measure," thanks to Dad's investment, I felt something crack. I didn't comment. I didn't call. I just stared at the photo until my eyes blurred. That was when it hit me how complete the pattern was. My effort turned into their success. My loyalty turned into their convenience. By the time the wedding invitation arrived embossed in gold, I already knew my role. The dependable sister. The one who helps behind the scenes. The one no one remembers once the lights come on. That night, leaving the Waverly Hotel, I thought I'd made peace with it. But as I drove home, the memories I'd buried surfaced again. My father's signature where mine should have been my mother's voice, telling me not to make a scene. Lila's laughter through the phone when she bragged about her new car. All of it came rushing back, and for the first time, I let myself wonder what it would take for them to finally see me. The streetlights flickered past one after another like snapshots of a life I no longer recognized. Somewhere deep inside, something small and dangerous began to stir the part of me that was done being invisible. I barely slept that night. The city outside my window felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I kept replaying the wedding in my head, my father's voice echoing through the ballroom, the words that had burned through everything I thought I still believed about family. By the time I drifted off, the sky was already paling over the San Francisco skyline. It must have been close to 1 a.m. when the vibration from my phone startled me awake. A new email had arrived, flagged as urgent, from Wellsfield Bank. The subject line read, "Transfer confirmation, 118 Harbor Street." My heart gave a slow, heavy thud. 118 Harbor Street. The old Bennett house. The one with the blue shutters and the oak tree in the front yard where Lila and I used to play when we were little. I opened the email. My breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. The message was short, a generic notification confirming a completed property transfer. Attached was a PDF of the deed. I clicked it open. There, under new owner, was the name Lila Bennett Lawrence. and next to previous owner, my own signature, my full name. Olivia Bennett, neatly typed, authenticated, notarized. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. My stomach clenched so hard it felt like I'd swallowed glass. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the page as if waiting for me to react. I scrolled down, reading the line that stated the date of transfer 3 weeks before the wedding. I whispered to myself, "No, this isn't real." I checked the attached documents again, every page, every header. It all looked legitimate. My address, my ID number, even the scanned signature that curved exactly like mine. Someone had forged everything. I dialed my parents' house. It rang until voicemail picked up. Then I called my mother's cell. She answered after 2 rings. "Mom, what is this?" I managed. "What did you do with the house?" Her voice was calm, too calm. "Some things are better left alone." Olivia. Better left alone? "That house was ours. Ours. You haven't lived there in years," she said. "It's not a big deal." I could hear the hum of a TV in the background, the soft chatter of voices. She wasn't shaken. She wasn't surprised. She just wanted me to stop asking questions. "Did you sign my name?" I asked, my throat tightening. Silence stretched across the line. When she spoke again, her tone was sharp. "You're being dramatic. Go to sleep." Then she hung up. I sat there staring at the dark screen of my phone. My own reflection stared back at me, pale and tired. The clock read 1:27 a.m. I opened my laptop, logged into the county records portal, and searched for the property file. It was there, updated, sealed, and approved by the notary public. I tried to remember the last time I'd seen the deed. It had always been kept in my father's office safe. He once told me he planned to leave it in both our names, Lila and me. I'd believed him. The longer I looked at the documents, the more obvious it became that this wasn't just a clerical error. Someone had gone through a lot of effort to make it appear real, and whoever it was had access to every detail of my life. I printed everything and spread the pages on my coffee table. I zoomed into the signature. It was almost perfect. Almost. The loop on the B was slightly different from mine. My heart pounded faster. Someone who knew me well enough to imitate me had done this. The next morning, I drove to the notary office listed on the document, a small brick building near the Embarcadero. The clerk behind the counter looked up with a polite smile until I slid the printed deed across the counter. "I need to see whoever notarized this," I said. She frowned, scanning the stamp at the bottom. "That would be Mr. Hayes. He's not in until tomorrow. Do you have records showing when this was signed?" She hesitated. "We can't release that without authorization, ma'am." I leaned closer. "It's my name on that paper. My property. Someone forged my signature." The woman's face softened slightly, but she still shook her head. "I'm sorry. It's against policy." I stepped back, trying to steady my voice. "Can you at least tell me the date?" She hesitated again, then lowered her voice. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. The week before the wedding. I left before I said something I'd regret. Outside, the wind off the bay felt sharp and cold. I sat in my car and scrolled through my phone, searching for anyone who could help. That was when another email notification popped up, this one from an anonymous address. No subject line, just one attachment. For a second, I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam. Then I saw the message, "Thought you should see this. Be careful who you trust." The attached file was small, less than a megabyte. I downloaded it anyway. When it opened, I saw a single-page report with the Wellsfield Bank logo at the top and a list of IP addresses below. My eyes caught on one detail immediately. The digital signature verification originated from the network of a company in downtown Chicago, Lawrence Group Design Holdings. My hands went cold. Adam's company. Lila's husband. I sat there staring at the screen, the traffic light outside blinking red across the windshield. They did this. Together. The realization sank in like ice. It wasn't just about a house. They'd taken my identity, my trust, and everything tied to my name. I thought of my mother's voice on the phone, calm and detached. She knew. She'd known all along. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the seat. The city was waking up, lights flickering on across the skyline, the world moving as if nothing had changed. But something inside me had. For years, I'd let them define what family meant. Tonight, with one email, they'd rewritten it without me. I watched the first train pass along the bay, its horn low and distant. In that sound, I felt the line finally snap between who I'd been and who I was becoming. By sunrise, I knew exactly what I had to do. By the time the sun climbed above the bay, I was already on the road to Los Angeles. The drive took nearly 6 hours, long enough for my thoughts to run wild and circle back to the same point over and over. I had proof that my identity had been used, that the transfer came from Lawrence Group's servers, but no idea how to fight it. Every time I thought about calling the police, my mother's voice echoed in my head, calm and polished. Some things are better left alone. David Keller was the only person I trusted to look at it. Years ago, when his small law firm in Chicago had been on the verge of bankruptcy, I helped him reorganize his finances through Bennett Interior's corporate contacts. He'd promised me once, if you ever need a favor, I'll be there. His office sat on the 24th floor of a glass building overlooking downtown LA. When I walked in, he was standing by the window, grayer and heavier than I remembered, but with the same steady eyes. "Liv Bennett," he said softly. "Haven't seen you in a while?" I dropped the folder of documents onto his desk. "You're about to see too much." He skimmed through the papers, the property transfer, the signature logs, the anonymous report with the IP address. As he read, his expression hardened. When he looked up again, there was no confusion, only anger. "Who else knows about this?" he asked. "My mother. Maybe my father. Definitely Lila and her husband." He exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. "Lawrence Group, that's Adam Lawrence's company, right?" "Yes." He nodded once. "Give me 24 hours. I'll trace this." The next day, I sat in a cafe across the street from his building, staring at my untouched coffee, while people rushed by outside. The world felt normal for everyone but me. When my phone buzzed, I answered immediately. "Meet me back at the office," David said. "I found something." He was waiting with his laptop open when I arrived. He turned the screen toward me. "The IP address that submitted the transfer wasn't random," he said. "It's a dedicated workstation inside Lawrence Group's accounting department. Whoever did this had admin access." I swallowed hard. Adam could be, or someone working under his orders. Either way, they used company credentials. That's corporate-level fraud, Olivia. I stared at the evidence until the numbers blurred. My family's betrayal had always been personal, emotional. Seeing it quantified in data made it feel colder, sharper. David leaned back. "There's something else." I reached out to a contact in the notary database, the guy who authenticated the document, Victor Hayes. He's been around a while, mostly clean record, but he recently declared a sudden income spike. How sudden? $15,000 marked as consultancy fees, paid directly from Lawrence Group. The words hung in the air. My chest tightened. "We need to talk to him," David said. We met Hayes 2 days later in a small office near Pasadena. He was in his 50s, balding with the restless energy of a man used to bending rules. He smiled too easily when he shook our hands. "Mr. Hayes," David began laying out the documents. "We're looking into this transfer record. You notarized this signature." Hayes glanced at the paper and then at me. His smile faltered. "If you're suggesting something improper, I assure you I follow the law." David kept his tone calm. "No one's accusing you. Yet. We just want to know how this came through your office." Hayes shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping the table. "The record shows Miss Bennett appeared in person," he said. "She showed ID. Everything checked out." I cut in. "I was in Chicago that week planning my sister's wedding." "I never met you." He hesitated, then tried again. "Maybe someone else presented the documents on your behalf. Family, perhaps." My pulse quickened. "You remember who?" He opened his mouth, then shut it again. David slid a printed statement across the desk. "This is a record of a payment from Lawrence Group to your business account labeled consultancy fee, dated the same day the deed was processed." Want to explain that Hayes's face drained of color. He looked from David to me, then toward the door like he wanted to run. "It was supposed to be harmless," he muttered finally. "They said it was just paperwork, nothing serious." Who said I asked? He rubbed his forehead. Adam Lawrence. And your mother. She was there that day. I thought you knew. The room went still. I felt something cold and electric rise through me, the kind of shock that doesn't let you breathe. My mother stood there while they forged my name. Hayes didn't answer. His silence was enough. David's voice cut through the quiet. You realize this is a felony, Victor. If you cooperate, we can make sure you're protected. Hayes nodded shakily, signing the affidavit David prepared on the spot. When we left, he looked at me once more, guilt written all over his face. Outside, the sun was blinding. I stopped on the sidewalk, gripping the folder to keep my hands from trembling. They erased me on paper because they couldn't do it to my face. David watched me carefully. Olivia, we can take this to the authorities, but you need to be ready for what comes next. I looked out at the traffic cars sliding by like water. My mother's voice echoed in my mind again, that same old phrase she'd said when I was younger, when she'd scolded me for being too outspoken. Lila is the face of our family. You're the backbone no one needs to see. Now they'd made that metaphor real. I turned back to David. Find me everything you can. Emails, transfers, whatever connects them. He nodded once. I will. For the first time in years, I felt something close to control settle in my chest. The line they'd drawn to cut me out had become the line I would use to trace them back. That night, as I drove north along the coast, the ocean stretched beside me, dark and endless. In the distance, lightning flashed over the water. The storm hadn't reached shore yet, but I could feel it coming. By morning, the storm had reached land. Rain hammered against my windshield as I pulled into my driveway. I didn't go inside right away. I just sat there listening to it, the sound of water against glass steady and relentless. My phone vibrated on the seat beside me. It was David. I've got something, he said when I answered. Big. You need to come to the office. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him in a small conference room, the blinds half drawn against the gray light. His desk was littered with printouts, coffee cups, and sticky notes. He looked exhausted, but focused the way he used to look when he was trying to find a loophole big enough to save a dying company. He slid a folder across the table. I dug deeper into Lawrence Group's financials. They're drowning. They've been bleeding money for years. I flipped through the pages, each one worse than the last. Debt, lawsuits, loans against phantom assets. So that's what this was, I said quietly, a merger to stay afloat. Stay. He nodded. Marriage and merger, same deal. He pushed another document toward me, a printed draft stamped, Merger Agreement. Confidential. The words on the page felt like acid under my skin. When the Bennett assets transfer to Lawrence Group, ownership shall be allocated as follows. 70% to Adam and Lila Lawrence, 30% retained under Bennett Interiors for brand continuity and public relations protection. Brand protection. The phrase burned. It meant they'd traded my name, my work, and the company I'd rebuilt for image management. I kept reading. My signature appeared again, copied from another document, reused without my consent. My throat tightened. David spoke quietly. There's more. My name's in there too. I looked up. What? He leaned back, his face tired. I advised them on the preliminary draft months ago. Back then, your father made it sound like a mutual family agreement. I didn't know they were cutting you out. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. You worked for them. He nodded once. I did, and now I'm helping you. Why? Because this isn't business anymore. It's fraud. And maybe because I owe you more than I ever admitted. I stared at him, trying to read the sincerity behind the guilt. Rain streaked down the window behind him, long silver lines against the glass. What happens if they find out you're helping me? He shrugged. Then I lose my license, maybe my job. But I'd rather that than live with this. I looked back at the document, tracing the lines of ink that turned my family into co-conspirators. My mind kept looping one phrase from childhood, my mother's favorite mantra. Family is our greatest investment. It had never been about love. It was always about returns. David stood and began pacing. "We can take this to the district attorney's office, but we'll need more than copies. We need proof the payments were intentional. Money trails, emails, anything that links Adam to the transfers. How do we get that?" He hesitated, then said, "We dig." The rest of the day blurred into hours of research and silence. I sat beside him at the desk while he sifted through databases and company filings, cross-checking dates and transaction codes. Every discovery came like a small wound, records of deposits from Bennett Interiors to Lawrence Group payments categorized as consulting expenses, even charity donations made through shell accounts that led back to Adam's CFO. By evening, David leaned back with a sigh. "You realize what this means, right? Your family didn't just sign away your inheritance, they helped launder assets through your name." I rubbed my temples. "And they married her off to make it look legitimate." He didn't argue. When I finally left his office, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like metal. I walked past the building's glass lobby and caught my reflection in the window. I looked different. Harder. Back in the car, I called Lila. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and tired like she'd been crying or pretending she hadn't. "Liv, hey, are you okay? I didn't bother with small talk. How long have you known about the merger?" There was a pause. I could hear her inhale sharply. "What merger?" "Don't. I've seen the documents." She hesitated again, then exhaled. "Adam handled that. It was business. Dad said it was just a formality. You signed the agreement. You watched them take everything." Her tone hardened. "You think you're the only one who sacrificed I did what they asked because someone had to keep this family standing?" My hands clenched around the steering wheel. "You did it to erase me." "That's not true," she said, her voice rising. "Then why my name? Why my signature?" Silence filled the line, thick and heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "Because Dad said you'd never agree?" The truth hit like a physical blow. I hung up before she could say more. Outside, the clouds began to break apart, the setting sun bleeding through in streaks of gold. The light felt cruel. I sat there staring at nothing, trying to remember when I'd stopped being angry and started feeling numb. They didn't marry for love. They married for survival, for leverage, for control. When the first drops of rain began to fall again, I whispered to no one. They didn't marry for love. They married to erase me. That night, I printed every file, every page of evidence, and laid them across my kitchen counter. Each one told the same story: my family's empire built on betrayal, gilded with Lila's smile. I didn't sleep. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I decided this wasn't just going to be about revenge anymore. It was about proof, about truth. By the time morning light touched the blinds, my decision was made. It was time to stop surviving them and start exposing them. The morning came cold and sharp. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by papers, the smell of stale coffee clinging to the air. Every document, every email, every financial statement was spread out like pieces of a map that led to the truth. For 2 nights, I'd barely slept, pacing the apartment, wondering if this was worth the destruction it would bring. Was I really ready to ruin my own family? The question looped in my mind until it hollowed me out. My father's laugh, my mother's perfume, Lila's voice calling me sis, in that sugary way it all flickered like ghosts. For years, I had carried their image of family like a shield. Now that shield felt like a lie. I could no longer live inside. By sunrise, I called David. I told him I was done waiting. He didn't sound surprised. "Just bring everything," he said. "We'll make it official." We met that afternoon at his office. The sky outside was bruised with gray, a storm gathering over Los Angeles. David organized the files, double-checked the timestamps, then sealed them in a thick envelope. "This goes to the district attorney's office in San Mateo," he said quietly. "Once it's in, it's out of our hands." I watched as he placed the envelope into a courier bag. The sound of the zipper closing felt final. A line crossed. The next few weeks blurred into a waiting game. I went to work as if nothing had changed, nodding through meetings, answering calls, pretending the world hadn't tilted. Then one morning, David called with a single sentence. It's happening. They're opening an investigation. The San Mateo DA's office was charging Lawrence Group with potential corporate fraud and falsification of property transfers. My name was listed in the complaint as identity misuse victim and key witness. The words looked strange together. Victim, witness. David said the authorities would need corroboration. Someone from inside the company. That's how we found Daniel Rhodes. He had been the chief financial officer at Lawrence Group until Adam forced him out 6 months earlier. David arranged a meeting at a small diner in Palo Alto. When Daniel walked in, he looked like a man who'd aged too fast. Shirt-wrinkled eyes, wary hands trembling slightly as he reached for his coffee. "You sure you want to do this?" David asked. Daniel gave a tired laugh. "What choice do I have? I kept quiet long enough." He handed me a small flash drive wrapped in tissue. I stared at it, feeling its weight despite its size. "That's everything," he said. "Internal transfers, offshore accounts, and one recording." "Recording of what?" He looked me straight in the eyes. "Of Adam and your mother." I hesitated before plugging it into David's laptop. The audio crackled, then voices filled the room. Adam's smooth tone came first, detached and certain. "Once she signs, she's out. You'll have your legacy, Evelyn." There was a pause. Then my mother's voice, low and steady. "Just make sure nothing traces back to us." The sound hit me like a punch. I hadn't expected to hear her voice again, not like that. My mother, who used to tuck my hair behind my ear before school, who told me family came before everything, speaking like a stranger. I closed the laptop. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. David finally broke the silence. "This is enough to blow it open." I nodded, but my throat burned. It wasn't victory. It was loss multiplied. That night I went home and poured a glass of wine I didn't drink. I stared out the window at the lights across the city, feeling the distance between us stretch like an unbridgeable gulf. My phone buzzed on the counter. Lila's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Liv, please," she said. "Don't do this." Her voice trembled, but there was still that undertone of entitlement, the same one she'd had since we were kids. "Do what I asked. Tell the truth. You don't understand. Adam will go to prison. Mom's falling apart. You should have thought about that before you signed my name." There was a pause, then her voice cracked. "We were trying to protect the family." I almost laughed. "Protect it from what?" "From honesty, from consequences." She sniffled. "You don't have to destroy us." I stared at the skyline, at the glowing windows of other people's lives. "You already did," I said softly and hung up. The next morning, David called again. The DA's office had moved fast. Subpoenas went out to Lawrence Group and investigators were combing through their accounts. He sounded almost impressed. "You lit a fire under them," he said. I didn't feel proud. I felt hollow. Every headline that appeared online made me flinch. "Corporate heiress implicated in fraud scheme. Lawrence Group under investigation." My family name was everywhere. Reporters camped outside my building for a few days before giving up. I stopped checking my phone except for David's calls. He said the DA's team would need me to testify eventually. They'd already verified Daniel's data. The flash drive had sealed everything. At night, I kept replaying that recording in my head, my mother's voice blending with Adam's, until I couldn't tell who was worse. Each time it ended on the same sentence, "You'll have your legacy." Legacy. That was all any of them ever cared about. The word didn't mean family anymore. It meant power dressed up as love. One evening, David sent me a text. "It's official. The investigation's public. Check the news." I turned on the TV. A reporter stood in front of Lawrence Group's headquarters, the logo gleaming behind her. She spoke about pending fraud allegations, falsified documents, and a family business entangled in deception. For a moment, I just watched in silence. My name wasn't mentioned, not yet. But the storm had broken, and there was no stopping it now. Outside, sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. I pressed my hand to the glass, feeling the cold seep through. Justice had begun to move slow, but unstoppable. And in that cold reflection, I saw myself not as the forgotten daughter anymore, but as the one who finally pulled the truth into the light. 6 weeks passed before the storm truly hit. At first, it was just murmurs online, a few business articles about a possible audit, whispers in trade magazines that Lawrence Group had been flagged for irregularities. Then one morning, I woke to my phone buzzing nonstop. My inbox was flooded with messages, news alerts, links from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Every headline screamed the same words: the Bennett-Lawrence scandal. I turned on the TV. There it was, my family's name plastered across every major network. The anchor's voice was polished and cold as she described a growing federal investigation into fraud, forged documents, and property transfers linked to Lawrence Group and its subsidiary Bennett Interiors. Then the screen shifted to a clip that made my stomach twist. Someone had posted footage from the wedding. My father smiling under chandeliers, raising a glass. "We're so proud of our only daughter," he said. The video had been uploaded to TikTok by a guest, and in 2 days, it had gone viral. Comment sections exploded. People were dissecting every second, every gesture, wondering how a man could erase one child in front of hundreds. By the end of that week, the FBI had raided Lawrence Group's headquarters. Adam was arrested on charges of fraud, bribery, and money laundering. The company's assets were frozen. News anchors called it one of the biggest white-collar takedowns in years. My mother, Evelyn, was named as a cooperating witness pending investigation for her role in the forged property transfer. My father, Charles, faced foreclosure on both their homes after banks demanded repayment on loans he'd guaranteed for the company. Their world, built on glass and pride, was cracking from every angle. I sat alone in my apartment, watching the news unfold on my laptop. There was no satisfaction in it, only a strange numbness. For years, I had imagined what justice might feel like. It wasn't fire, it wasn't triumph, it was quiet, cold. Then came the interview. Lila appeared on a morning show, tearful and trembling under studio lights. Her hair perfectly styled, her makeup natural, her voice shaking just enough to sound sincere. She blamed Adam, claimed he had manipulated her, and hinted that their mother had forced her to sign things she didn't understand. I watched as she dabbed her eyes, saying she'd been naive, that she only wanted to protect her family. Within hours, social media turned on her. Viewers called her a social climber, an opportunist, a fraud wrapped in designer clothes. For the first time, people saw her the way I had for years, not as the golden girl, but as the performance my parents had crafted. The next day, David called. "It's over," he said. "Adam's in custody, your parents are cooperating, and the company's done." I asked, "What happens now?" He hesitated. "The court will appoint a liquidator. Bennett Interiors will be dissolved." I nodded, though I wasn't sure he could hear it. It had been my life's work once, my late nights, my decisions, my name behind the numbers. Now it was gone, folded into evidence boxes and court files. That evening, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Liv," my father's voice said, raw and tired. I didn't speak. "We're still family," he said softly. "We made mistakes, but we're still family." I closed my eyes. The words used to mean something. Now they felt like an echo from another world. "Families protect," I said. "You erased me." There was a pause, a small sound on the line, maybe a breath or a sob. Then the call ended. I set the phone down and walked to the window. The city glowed beneath me, its lights scattered like fragments of some other life. On the news, images of my parents' house flashed again, the estate sign out front, the words "property seized" posted by the sheriff's office. By the end of the month, Bennett Interiors was officially liquidated. Employees were let go, the showroom emptied, the name removed from the building's facade. For the first time in nearly 40 years, there was no Bennett logo in the Chicago design district. People called it poetic justice. I called it inevitable. In the quiet that followed, I found myself driving to the old neighborhood one night, parking across from the house where I grew up. The windows were dark, the garden overgrown. A for sale sign leaned in the yard. The porch light flickered like it was trying to hold on to something that was already gone. I sat there for a long time, the car engine humming softly, thinking about everything that had led here. About the little girl who once believed her parents' promises. About the woman who had to destroy those promises to finally breathe. The rain started again, light and steady. I rolled down the window, letting the cool air fill the car. Across the street, a curtain shifted slightly as if someone was watching, but I didn't look closer. It didn't matter anymore who was left standing inside that house. What mattered was that I was outside of it, and for the first time, I didn't want to go back. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed faint and fading. I started the engine and pulled away, leaving behind the wreckage of their lies. Tomorrow, the papers would announce the final sale of Bennett Interiors, another scandal swallowed by the news cycle. But for me, it wasn't about the headlines. It was about the quiet that came after, the kind that only arrives when the truth has finally done its work. A year later, I woke to the sound of rain against the window. Portland had a way of softening everything, even memories. The streets below glistened in the early light, and the coffee shop across from my apartment was just opening its doors. I had come here after everything ended, chasing the quiet I once thought I didn't deserve. On my desk sat a folded newspaper, the same one I'd kept since last spring. The headline had faded with time. The Fall of the Bennetts. I unfolded it slowly, reading the words I already knew by heart. It didn't sting anymore. The names, the numbers, the public shame. It was all just history now, a story that no longer belonged to me. I folded the paper again and slid it onto a shelf next to files labeled Freedom Interiors. Freedom Interiors had started as an idea in the middle of a sleepless night. I wanted to build something honest from the ashes of everything that had been false. Now it was real. A nonprofit organization helping women who had been trapped in financial abuse, women who had been silenced, erased, like I once was. The office was small, but bright, filled with light wood furniture and soft green plants. The sign outside still caught me off guard. Sometimes the words painted clean on glass, Freedom Interiors. The first time I saw it, I stood there until tears blurred the letters. David visited once a month, still working cases in California, but helping us with legal guidance when he could. That afternoon, he stopped by the office. He looked around with a half smile. "You've done well," he said, setting his briefcase down. I poured him coffee and laughed. "I still can't get used to the idea that I have an office." He looked at me carefully. Was it worth it? I thought about that for a long moment. About the sleepless nights, the courtrooms, the endless headlines. About the silence that followed after the noise faded. I met his eyes. "Revenge fades," I said. "But freedom lasts." He nodded, and for a moment there was nothing left to say. Later that day, after he left, I walked to the window and watched the rain slow to a drizzle. Across the street, a mural covered a brick wall painted in bright blues and yellows. It showed a woman standing at the edge of a storm, her hair lifting in the wind. Someone had written a line at the bottom: "Start again." I stepped outside. The air smelled of rain and coffee and possibility. The streets were wet, and reflections shimmered in every puddle. I walked the few blocks to the building we had just signed a lease on, the second location for Freedom Interiors. When I reached the corner, I stopped short. The building was old, but the structure was solid. The brick facade was familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. It took me a moment to realize why. This was once the Chicago branch of Bennett Interiors, long sold, forgotten, and stripped of its name. The irony hit me like a whisper from the past. The renovation crew had already begun cleaning the front windows. Behind the glass, a new sign leaned against the wall, wrapped in plastic. I stepped inside, peeled back a corner of the wrapping, and read the painted words, "Freedom Interiors, Portland Chapter." My reflection appeared faintly in the glass, older now, steadier. For the first time, I didn't see the daughter they erased. I saw the woman who rebuilt something from what they tried to destroy. I walked through the empty rooms, listening to the echo of my footsteps against the wood floors. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and new paint. Where there had once been blueprints and showrooms filled with my father's ambitions, there would now be counseling offices and workshops. Where there had been vanity and deception, there would be purpose. I sat on the window ledge for a moment, looking out at the street. The clouds had begun to break, sunlight spilling across the pavement. It caught the edge of the new sign, a flash of gold glinting off the letters. They built their empire on lies, I thought. I built mine on truth. Outside, a group of volunteers arrived, laughing as they carried boxes inside. Their voices filled the space with something warm and human, something I hadn't heard in years. I stood to meet them, smiling without thinking. As I helped unpack the boxes, I glanced at the framed newspaper headline on the wall near the door. I had kept it not as a reminder of them, but as a marker of the line I'd crossed the day I stopped being a victim and started being free. The last box was labeled in my handwriting, "Outreach Materials." Inside were pamphlets, letters, and a stack of cards printed with our mission statement. On top of the pile sat a quote we used on every brochure. "If you were erased from your own story, how would you write it back?" I held the card for a moment, the question reflecting in the glass of the window beside me. Then I slipped it into the display stand near the entrance, stepped outside into the light, and locked the door behind me. The sky was clearing, sunlight breaking through like forgiveness. I stood there for a while, breathing in the clean air before walking down the street, the sound of my own footsteps steady and sure against the quiet of a city that finally felt like home.